Hey, it's Christina. Many of my friends are having a really hard time finding instant yeast or active dry yeast at the grocery store right now because we're in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic. So a lot of people are turning to sourdough to help with their baking. I've been working with sourdough since 2017, so I've been at it for a little bit of time, and I wanted to share with you my knowledge about sourdough to help you have success in your journey with sourdough, but to also spark an interest about the science behind sourdough. So a sourdough starter is cultivating the natural yeast that occurs in your own environment and using that in your baking to help your dough rise or leaven. So yeast has a symbiotic relationship with lactobacillus bacteria, and it's the lactobacillus bacteria, it feeds on the sugar in your dough, and then it creates a byproduct, lactic acid or acetic acid, as it ferments. And it's that lactic acid and that acetic acid that gives sourdough its notorious tang and bite to it that we all love. So the flavors of sourdough can vary greatly. So it can vary based on how you treat your own starter, whether you store it in a colder environment or a warmer environment. If you're storing your sourdough starter in the refrigerator, your lactobacillus bacteria is more apt to create more acetic acid as the byproduct. So it's going to have a more intense bite, like that type of bite when you bite into a pickle, intense tang. Whereas if you store your starter on your kitchen countertop, it's a warmer environment. The lactobacillus bacteria byproduct after it metabolizes will be more lactic acid, a more milder tang, like when you eat yogurt. But also there's variations of sourdough flavor across the globe. So lactobacillus bacteria has many different subtypes to it. So the species of lactobacillus bacteria varies. So if you're in San Francisco, your sourdough is going to taste very different than if you're in New England or perhaps even Alaska. There's just different species of lactobacillus that's out there. But as you become more comfortable in baking sourdough, you're going to learn more about how to manipulate your starter so that you can get different rises and different flavors based on how you store it or your hydration levels. So yeast in your culture really favors a drier environment. So you'll see some sourdough recipes that use a starter that's a little bit on the stiffer or drier side for a higher rise in it versus others that may have more flavor and texture requirements that require it to be a little bit wetter. But as you work with your starter and you are feeding it, which is really what this video is about, I keep mine at 100% hydration, which is just a fancy term for I use equal parts flour and equal parts water to store my starter. And the reason why I do that is because it makes the math really easy. So if I need to convert to my hydration levels in a sourdough recipe and mine's a 1-to-1 ratio, it's really easy to figure out how I need to increase or decrease the hydration to it. But also it's easy to remember when you're feeding it and you have a million other things going on and the last thing you want to do is calculations. And it's keeps the yeast and the bacteria at an equal level if you're using 100% hydration. So the yeast and the lactobacillus bacteria in your culture really do well at protecting their own environment. So it's in and of itself, it's rather safeguarded against contamination. Doesn't mean it's invincible. You can have contamination. So every time you go to feed your sourdough starter or use it in baking, you always want to check it for any streaks of color. Usually it'll be like pink or red if it's contaminated. And you also want to check the aroma. It should smell like an intense sourdough bread smells, nothing foul to it. I have maintained this starter since 2017. It's my first starter and I have not had any issues with contamination. From what I hear, it's rather rare, but it's just something that you want to keep in mind. So the only way to really kill a sourdough starter is if you freeze it or if you bake it. It's pretty darn hardy. I keep mine in the refrigerator, and I have an alarm set on my phone that goes off at 5 p.m. every Saturday to remind me to feed my starter. But have I gone longer than a week between feeds of my starter? Absolutely. So I'm a mom of 8-month-old twins, and when I had newborn twins, feeding my starter was honestly the last thing on my mind. So we went about probably over a month between feeding my starter. It just lived in the back of the refrigerator, and if I could revive it, that's great, and if not, I wasn't going to lose sleep over it. At the end of the day, it's flour and water. But to my surprise, after it must have been about 4 to 6 weeks that I went without feeding it, and after that first feed, it was like nothing happened to it. It really bounced back right away. If you go a long duration between your feeds, you'll see a buildup of alcohol, which is the byproduct of the starter, and it looks like really watery tan liquid. If there's just a small layer over it, say maybe half a centimeter to a centimeter deep, usually I just stir that back in. But if it's like an inch tall, like when I neglected it for that amount of time, I usually dump some off into the sink and then stir my starter and feed it after that. So a few different ways that you can store your starter. If you bake really often and you're going to be baking bread every day or every other day, you may want to keep it on your countertop. In that warmer environment, it means that your yeast and your bacteria are going to stay more active, which also means you're going to have a little bit more maintenance with your starter. So you're going to need to feed it every 12 hours. I am a mom and I work full time, so I'm not baking bread every day. So I keep it in my refrigerator and I feed it once a week. I may bake with it that week, I may not. And so if you're keeping it on your countertop, when you go to bake with it, you're going to have less time readying your starter. So you don't have to do so many feeds to perk it up to get ready for your starter. Whereas if you keep it in your fridge, you may have to feed it 2 or 3 times in order for it to be ready. I'm a home baker. I'm not super picky about my bread rises. So I usually just feed it once and let it rise for a few more hours and it's good to go. Vessels that you would want to store your sourdough starter in. I store mine in this pottery crock. It's by Great Bay Pottery, which is a local group in New Hampshire that made it. But you don't need a pottery crock. You could use just a glass jar with the lid screwed on loosely. You just want the vessel to be about 2/3 bigger than what your sourdough culture is. So if you can see, let's see if I can get you to see inside here. That is about how much excess room I have in here. So it allows for when your sourdough is feeding, it's going to increase in volume. So you want a little extra space so it contains it. And doesn't overflow if it's a super active starter. How tight or how loose the lid needs to be. The lactobacillus bacteria is anaerobic, which means you don't have to worry about it getting any oxygen to survive. It completely survives without oxygen. You do want a little bit of ventilation, however. So having just the lid just on it has been great because it does emit gases, so you want those to escape so that you don't have contents under pressure and then it explodes on you. That's really the only reason why you would need a little bit of ventilation. It's not for the starter to live, it's more to control the mess in your refrigerator. So I got my starter initially from King Arthur Flour in Vermont. They sell fresh starter, and I thought that it was really interesting because it's from New England. I'm from New England, so it's the same species of lactobacillus bacteria that already exists in my environment. But I also felt it had a good historical context because it's a starter that's been descended from a starter from the 1700s. So I really appreciated that aspect of it. But if you don't have access to fresh starter, there's a lot of shortages out there, and with social distancing, you might not be able to get one from a family member or friend. So you can totally make your own starter on your own, which will be the next video I make. I'll go through how to make your own starter using different flours as to what you might have already access to in your kitchen, because there's a big flour shortage right now too. When you feed your starter, you're going to want to use unbleached flour because you don't want that bleach to interfere with the bacteria or yeast production. If you like to bake with whole grains, that's awesome. You can feed your starter with whole wheat or wheat flour. However, it's going to be a lot of upkeep. With the whole grain flours, it makes the yeast and the bacteria much more active, so it's going to eat through that flour a lot faster, and you're going to have to feed it a lot more. If you go to bake a whole wheat bread, you can still use a starter that's been fed with all-purpose flour. You would just build it up with your whole wheat flour to match the recipe, and the amount of all-purpose flour that's left in it is pretty negligible in it. So really the best flour ideally to feed your starter with is all-purpose flour. I like to use King Arthur's all-purpose flour. I am a big fan of King Arthur in general. I like that they are an employee-owned company. That means a lot to me. I also think that they have really high standards when it comes to their product. Their protein levels in their all-purpose flour often rival the protein levels of bread flour from other manufacturers. They're also a certified B Corporation, so whenever I can, I like to support King Arthur flour. I use this to maintain my starter at 100% hydration. You may not have all-purpose flour in your kitchen right now. You may have bread flour. Bread flour is fine. You can use that as long as it's unbleached. But the bread flour typically has a higher protein content than all-purpose flour does. So you may find that when you are feeding your starter, it's stiffer and drier than what an all-purpose flour may be. So you may need to adjust your water level and add maybe a tablespoon or two more water to your starter if you're going to keep it at 100% hydration. So when I feed my starter, I use equal ratios of flour, water, and starter. So I highly recommend, if you don't already own a food scale, to get one. You can find one for about $10 or $15 on Amazon. I think I got mine from a local Bed Bath & Beyond a while ago. Things you want to look for in a scale is having units to be displayed in grams, and having the tare button, which is just zeroing out the scale. So if you measure 100 grams of flour, you can hit 0 and put your water in, hit 0, and then put your starter in, so that if it's 105 and 102, you don't have to really do any math. You can just zero it out. So you don't have to use a scale, though. If Amazon delivery is delayed, or whatever reason you don't use a scale, you don't have room for it in your kitchen, you can totally use measuring cups. For feeding it, you would want to do just a scant cup of flour, which would be about 113 grams, to a half of cup of water, which would be 113 grams of water. Tap water use is fine in most cases. If your water is heavily treated and smells like chemicals coming out, or you have a reverse osmosis system, you might want to use bottled water. But for most people, your tap water is perfectly fine to feed it. So when you feed it, you just want to mix it well to make sure that there's no dry spots in it. And then I put it back into the clean vessel, and I let it sit on my counter for a couple of hours until I see 4, maybe 5 bubbles in it, and then it goes into my refrigerator to live for the rest of the week. And I like to leave it on my countertop for a couple of hours so it comes up to room temperature. It feeds a little bit better at that level, just so I know it has a kickstart and it feeding. And then I put it back into the fridge. So as you take 100 grams of starter out, you're going to have about 200 grams of starter that's just going to be discard. So you can toss it if you want, but there's lots of sourdough discard recipes you could use it in too. So you could make crumpets, or you could make chocolate cake, or you could make pizza dough with the sourdough starter. So you can put it in a separate bowl and use it about 1 to 2 weeks after. If you want to, so that you don't have much waste. So this is what my sourdough starter looks like now. I think I need a better light for you guys, but it's got some good bubbles to it, which means it's nice and active. I fed this on Saturday and it's Wednesday now, so it's about halfway through its normal cycle of eating, but I'm gonna go ahead and feed it today just to show you what my process looks like for that. So I'm gonna angle you down here. All right, so here I have my scale, I have my crock, I have a bowl, so I'm going to put that on. I'm going to hit tare so it zeroes it out completely. And then I'm going to mix my starter so that if there's any of the alcohol on top, it mixes in and it's nice and even. And then I'm going to take about 100 grams out of the crock. It's 125. I'll take a little bit out from there. 104, I'm going to call it good. So then I'm going to hit tare to zero it out. And I'm going to add 100 grams of water. $107, good enough. And I'm going to add 100 grams of flour. $102, perfect. So then I'm just going to mix that around and make a mess, because that's what I do. And it's probably best to mix it off of the scale. You just want to mix it until you don't see any dry spots left. And I like to get out to the bottom and kind of fold it a couple of times so that you're getting all the components mixed. So this is about how much I have left. So you could use this for baking. You could give some to a friend. I'm just going to put this into a separate bowl. To use later. I'm going to wash out my crock, put this back into the crock, let it sit on my counter for a couple of hours. There we go. and then it'll have a couple of bubbles to it. I'll put it back in the refrigerator and I'll see it again on Saturday. So I hope that was helpful, and I hope that you, if you have any questions or any comments, leave them on the page so that I can answer them or focus what my other videos about sourdough will be to help you. And I'll be working on making a sourdough starter from scratch so you can see what the process looks like and how it behaves with different flour types. So stay well, and I'll see you soon.